Late April, 1945. The Netherlands lay silent beneath a brittle, colourless sky. The war was not yet over, but the end was close enough to smell, that strange mix of smoke, thawing earth, and something sour, like grief that had lingered too long. The tulip fields, once a blaze of spring, stood stripped and skeletal, their bulbs long since eaten. The canals mirrored the low clouds, unmoving, pale as old tin. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed weakly, more out of habit than hunger. Hunger no longer needed to announce itself. It was the air itself. Then came the sound. At first, faint, a tremor beneath the wind, the familiar hum of engines approaching. It rolled over the horizon like a memory of terror. People froze where they stood. For 5 years, that sound had meant one thing: death from above. Bombers, the name alone enough to send families running to cellars, to prayer, to silence. Children who had grown up in the war's shadow knew it by heart, the pitch, the rhythm, the dread it carried. But this time, something was different. The sky was too clear, the formation too low, and the guns, there was no fire, no chase, just the steady, synchronized flight of heavy planes, their bellies full, their intent unknown. From the dikes and half-collapsed barns, faces emerged. Thin, pale, hollow-eyed faces that had forgotten the reflex of hope. Men leaned on shovels that had turned no soil for months. Women shaded their eyes against the glare. A child pointed upward. The engines grew louder. Shadows of wings swept across the fields like ghosts. Inside the villages, church bells were silent, melted for metal long ago. But in the air, there was a strange harmony, mechanical, precise, almost tender in its rhythm. No explosions followed. No fire tore through roofs. Instead, something tumbled from the plains. White specks, hundreds of them, drifting slowly, impossibly, toward the earth. At first, no one moved. The instinct to hide was stronger than curiosity. Yet, as the first bundles struck the ground, bursting not with shrapnel, but with sacks of flour, tins of food, cans of milk, a murmur rippled through the crowd. Then disbelief, then something that might have been joy. A single line fades onto the screen. For the first time, the bombers would bring life. For a moment, the Dutch sky, so long a ceiling of fear, became a bridge between enemies. An old farmer knelt beside a broken parachute, his trembling fingers tracing the markings on a tin. U.S. Army ration, Type C. His lips moved, but no sound came. Around him, others gathered, cautious, reverent, as though touching relics. High above, the bombers turned in formation, glinting in the dim sun, their engines receding into silence. What had been instruments of ruin were now vessels of mercy. What had been the machinery of war had become, for one brief moment, the hand of compassion. The camera lingers on the sky, wide, endless, indifferent, and then, slowly, fades to the faces below. Fear gives way to disbelief, disbelief to wonder, and wonder to something deeper, quieter, harder to name, perhaps forgiveness, or simply the beginning of hunger's end. Winter, 1944-45, the last cruelest season of the war. The Dutch call it de honger winter, the hunger winter, a phrase that even now carries the weight of empty stomachs and unspoken grief. By then, the Netherlands had been under German occupation for more than 4 years. Liberation was rumoured to be close. The Allies had reached the southern provinces. But the western cities, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, and Utrecht, remained under siege by starvation. When the Allied advance faltered after the failure of Operation Market Garden, the Germans retaliated. They cut off the food routes, flooded the polders, seized the barges, and left the western Netherlands isolated, a landlocked island of despair. The cold arrived early that year. Rivers froze solid. Canals became black mirrors for the grey sky. Coal had vanished months ago. Families burned furniture, doors, even books, Whole libraries sacrificed for a few hours of heat. The air inside the homes was thick with the smell of smoke and damp wool, of boiled tulip bulbs and desperation. There was food somewhere, but it belonged to the occupiers. The cities became graveyards of appetite. Adults grew skeletal, children swollen with edema. Hospitals ran out of medicine, schools turned into shelters. Hunger changed faces, thinned voices, slowed gestures. It erased laughter first, then memory. In Amsterdam, a teacher named Johanna recorded in her journal, "Each day begins with waiting, waiting for bread that never comes, waiting for death that comes too easily. The children are quiet now. Even the smallest ones no longer cry." On the outskirts of The Hague, a farmer named Willem hid his last cow behind a wall of straw, not from thieves, but from his neighbours. "We used to share everything," he wrote, "until hunger taught us the meaning of fear." And in a tiny flat above a canal, a child named Hendrik kept a small notebook, writing in pencil stubs. "Mama says we must chew slow so our stomachs think it's more. Papa's eyes look like the windows, empty." Each entry, each testimony, carries the sound of slow dying, the silence between heartbeats stretching longer each day. By February, the snow had turned grey with soot. The dead were buried shallowly when they were buried at all. Many simply froze where they fell, their outlines fading into the landscape. The Dutch government in exile, broadcasting from London, begged the world for help. But help could not yet come. The Allies were still fighting across the Rhine, and the Germans, though defeated in spirit, held fast to their orders. The camera pans through the streets, bicycles with wooden wheels, empty windows, a mother trading her wedding, ring for a loaf of rye bread smuggled from the countryside, a man cuts bark from a tree, boils it into paste, a woman scrapes wallpaper for its flour glue. Somewhere, an old piano is dismantled, not for music, but for fuel. There is no sound of battle here, only the whisper of hunger, a quiet more deadly than gunfire. And yet, beneath the frost, something human endures. People share what little they have, a piece of carrot, a scrap of cloth, a match. Priests bless pots of boiling water as if it were soup. In the stillness, faith flickers, small, almost invisible, but alive. By March, the famine reached its peak. The death toll climbed to tens of thousands. But beyond the suffering, something else was happening, a moral exhaustion that transcended politics. The occupiers, too, were starving. German soldiers begged for bread from the same civilians they had once oppressed. Authority itself was collapsing. Still, no one dared believe that salvation could come from the sky. The sound of engines had always meant destruction. The people had learned to hide at the first tremor in the air. And then, late April, the rumble returned. A dull vibration rolled across the horizon. Some thought it was artillery. Others feared it was the final bombardment before surrender. The instinct to flee ignited. Mothers clutching children, men glancing towards cellars already crowded with ghosts. But the planes did not fall upon them. They circled, low and slow, their bellies gleaming in the pale sun. From their holds, shapes began to drop, hundreds, then thousands, drifting down like a strange, silent snowfall. The disbelief was immediate. People stared, mouths open, unable to process what their eyes insisted was real. The bundles struck roofs, courtyards, frozen fields, and when they burst open, the smell was unmistakable. Food. For months, the people had looked to the ground for survival, digging, scavenging, waiting. Now they lifted their eyes. The sky, once the source of their fear, had changed. It was no longer the colour of death. It was the colour of deliverance. England, May 1st, 1945. The war was nearly over, though the men stationed at the airfields of East Anglia did not yet know what peace would feel like. They woke before dawn, as always, their bodies tuned to the ritual of flight. Coffee, briefings, checklists, the smell of oil and frost. In the distance, rows of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators stood ghost-like in the fog, wings heavy with dew. The 8th Air Force had been the muscle of the Allied air campaign. Thousands of bombing runs over Germany, railways, factories and cities. Their engines had darkened skies and levelled nations. The crews carried the sound of those missions inside them, the whistle of flak, the thud of shrapnel, the silence that followed when a friend's plane failed to return. But this morning there was something different in the air. An order passed from headquarters to the briefing rooms. New mission, low altitude, Netherlands, targets, designated drop zones. Confusion spread through the ranks. No coordinates for military objectives. No mention of ammunition or enemy defences. And then the detail that made every man look up. Cargo, food supplies. The words hung in the cold air, almost absurd in their simplicity. Lieutenant Robert Bob Swanson, 24 years old, commander of the B-17 Ruthie's Run, read the typed orders twice, his fingers tracing the line. Humanitarian relief operation, codenamed Chowhound. He had flown 34 missions over occupied Europe. He had watched cities burn beneath him, Rotterdam, Hamburg, Cologne, and felt nothing but the dull ache of duty. The idea that his aircraft, designed for destruction, would now deliver bread instead of bombs, felt like a contradiction too vast to grasp. Across the room, another pilot muttered, "So we're supposed to feed them now?" Someone else laughed, the kind of laugh that comes when the brain cannot quite accept mercy after so much violence. At the front of the room, the commanding officer spoke clearly, deliberately. "Gentlemen, this mission is unarmed. No defensive fire. You'll fly low, 400 feet. The Germans have agreed to a temporary ceasefire. You will not be fired upon." A murmur of disbelief. No guns, no escort, over enemy territory. It was not a mission. It was a leap of faith. The officer continued, his voice softer. "Our orders come from Eisenhower himself. The Dutch are starving. This is an agreement between us, the Germans, and the Swedish Red Cross. It's called Operation Chowhound. The British are launching their own Operation Manna. We'll fly side by side." Silence followed. The men stared at one another. Some smiled, uncertainly. Others frowned, unable to reconcile the image of the enemy with the image of the starving. For years, they had been taught to see Europe as a battlefield, not as a body in pain. Outside, the sun began to rise over the airfield. Thin, cold, filtered through the mist. Mechanics loaded the planes not with bombs, but with burlap sacks. Flour, margarine, powdered milk, canned vegetables, chocolate. The smell of wheat replaced that of gunpowder. Swanson walked slowly across the tarmac. He ran his hand over the aluminum skin of his bomber, the same plane that had dropped tons of explosives over the continent. Beneath the cockpit window, the painted pin-up girl smiled, her name still bright, Ruthie's Run. He thought of his mother's kitchen back in Wisconsin, the smell of bread, the sound of rain on the roof, and for the first time, the mission ahead seemed personal. Nearby, a crewman joked half-heartedly, "Imagine getting shot down for a bag of flour." Swanson didn't laugh. If it feeds one child, it's worth it. The engines began to roar, one by one, across the field, a low rising chorus that filled the dawn. But this time, the sound carried a different weight. It wasn't the prelude to death, but to something gentler, uncertain, redemptive. From the control tower, the air officer watched as hundreds of bombers lifted into the grey sky, their silver fuselages glinting like coins tossed into fate's hand. Behind them, the empty bomb bays swung open, revealing the shapes of their new cargo. Not weapons, but nourishment. The air smelled faintly of wheat and metal. Above the engines, the crew's voices crackled through the intercom. "Navigator, check bearings. Radio, confirm truce frequency. Pilot to crew, gentlemen, today we fly to feed." As they crossed the English coastline, the channel spread below them, calm, blue, almost holy in its quiet. Beyond it lay the occupied Netherlands, still waiting, still starving, unaware that salvation was already in the air. In that suspended moment, between war and peace, between habit and conscience, the sky itself seemed to hold its breath. The machines that once rained fire now carried the possibility of grace, and somewhere below, on the other side of the clouds, the first Dutch villagers were already listening, hearing the distant hum and wondering, with trembling hearts, if death had changed its voice. They came running from every direction, barefoot, hollow, trembling, yet moving with the sudden, reckless urgency of the living. The air was full of the heavy, rhythmic pulse of engines receding into distance. The last bombers had passed, their bellies emptied, their promise scattered over fields and rooftops. For a moment, silence followed, vast, incomprehensible, almost holy. Then the shouting began. Children's voices first, high and thin. Then the cries of women calling names, and the deeper, broken tones of men who had forgotten how to raise their voices at all. They flooded the fields where the parachutes had fallen, their hands reaching, fumbling, trembling over the sacks and crates that had struck the ground. The first packages were torn open with bare fingers. Flour burst out in small clouds, coating their skin, their faces, pale dust over faces already pale from hunger. Someone laughed, a sound so foreign it startled even him. Someone else fell to their knees, sobbing into the earth. The labels were printed in English. U.S. Army food supplies, tins of meat, powdered milk, canned vegetables, chocolate bars wrapped in silver foil. A farmer's wife held up a tin of spam as though it were gold. A little girl bit into a piece of chocolate, her mouth twitching in disbelief before the sweetness hit. She began to cry, a sound that was neither joy nor sorrow, but a fragile collision of both. In Amsterdam, word spread like fire. The planes brought food. People abandoned bicycles, carts, even their dead, running toward the fields beyond the city. Some carried sheets to gather flour, others buckets, sacks, anything that could hold a miracle. They came to the drop zones, open meadows, parks, frozen canals now thawing under the spring sun, and found what they had forgotten existed: abundance. There was no fighting, no hoarding, no violence. The starving shared instinctively, dividing everything into portions. A woman in a faded blue coat took a handful of flour, pressed it into the hands of a stranger, and whispered, "For your children too." A priest stood among them, blessing the parcels one by one. His voice cracked. "This bread," he said, "comes not from earth, but from heaven." Inside the cities, the ovens came alive again. Smoke curled from chimneys that had been cold for months. The smell of baking bread spread through the narrow streets, mixing with the sharp scent of coal and the river's damp air. For the first time in half a year, people gathered around tables not to mourn, but to eat. They spoke little. The act of chewing, swallowing, tasting seemed too sacred for conversation. Every bite was a resurrection. Children fell asleep with crumbs in their hands. Mothers wept quietly as they stirred thin soups thickened with powdered milk. A man lifted a crust of bread to his face, inhaling deeply before taking a bite, as though it were a sacrament. And in that shared, fragile abundance, something else returned, the idea of dignity. For hunger had not only taken bodies, it had stolen names, laughter, trust. It had turned people into ghosts long before death. But that day, with flour on their faces and crumbs on their lips, they began to feel human again. Not far away, near the Hague, German soldiers watched from the road, rifles slung over shoulders, eyes hollow. One of them, young, gaunt, hesitated before stepping forward. From his coat pocket, he took a piece of bread, hard and grey, and laid it gently on the ground beside a Dutch child eating from a can. The boy looked at him, then pushed half his chocolate bar toward the soldier. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The truce held, not by command, but by exhaustion, by the quiet recognition that hunger was the only enemy left. That night, the fields glowed faintly in the moonlight, dotted with fallen parachutes that rippled like ghosts of mercy. The people slept among them, guarding the food as if guarding the dawn itself. In one farmhouse, a woman wrote in her diary, "Today we ate bread baked from the flour that fell from the sky. The sound of the bombers no longer frightens me. I pray they return, not with fire, but with kindness." Meanwhile, in England, the reports came in. Operation Chowhound successful. No losses. Cargo received. The words sounded cold on paper, but across the sea they translated into warmth, life, and the slow, painful rediscovery of taste. The next morning, when the first light broke over the fields, children were already outside again, chasing the parachutes caught in trees. The silk was smooth, bright, clean. They wrapped themselves in it, laughing, turning the remnants of war into flags, dresses, dreams. In the cities, bread ovens burned day and night. The smell drifted through every street, heavy, sweet, real. It was the scent of survival. And somewhere far above, in the soft hum of memory, the sound of engines lingered, not as thunder, not as threat, but as a lullaby. The bombers had come, and for once they had given instead of taken. Between May 1st and May 8th, 1945, the skies above the western Netherlands became something no one had seen since the beginning of the war. Peaceful. A fragile corridor of mercy stretched between England and Holland, drawn not by diplomats or generals, but by hunger itself. The agreement had no pomp, no ceremony. It was arranged through hurried negotiations between Allied command, the German occupiers, and the neutral Swedes acting as intermediaries. It was a ceasefire without celebration, born not from goodwill, but exhaustion. Everyone had had enough, of dying, of fighting, of the endless winter. The German command in the Netherlands, led by Reichskommissar Arthur Seyss-Inquart, had been warned. Any interference with the food drops would mean annihilation. Yet even the most loyal soldiers no longer had the will to obey destructive orders. The war was collapsing faster than the regime that had sustained it. And so, the guns fell silent. Anti-aircraft crews, once poised for battle, now stood idle beside their flak batteries. Some leaned on their weapons and watched as the bombers roared overhead. The sound, once an omen of death, passed without fear. The silence that followed was strange, heavy, alive, full of the faint hum of engines and the whisper of wind. On May 2nd, near Rotterdam, a German officer named Kurt Ehlers stood on the embankment of a canal and watched the planes come in low, their shadows gliding across the water. He had not eaten properly in days. The rations allotted to his unit had dwindled to watery soup and dried bread. As the first white parachutes opened above him, something in his chest shifted, a sensation he had not allowed himself since before the war. Mercy. He removed his cap and murmured to the soldier beside him, "Even the sky is tired of killing." The words spread through the ranks like rumor or prayer. In the villages, Dutch civilians noticed too. German soldiers standing in silence, not stopping the collection, not shouting, not shooting. Some even helped gather the sacks, stacking them neatly at the edges of the fields before retreating into the shadows. It was not kindness exactly, but something more fragile, an unspoken truce between the defeated and the starving. Across the fields, the British joined in. Operation Manna, as they called it, had begun just a day before the Americans' Chowhound. Lancaster bombers, their black underbellies gleaming, flew at astonishingly low altitude, 300 feet, so low that children on rooftops could see the faces of the airmen looking down. The two missions soon merged into one vast act of cooperation. More than 5,500 flights in total, carrying over 11,000 tons of food. To the people below, it was not politics, it was miracle. From above, the airmen looked down on waving crowds, rooftops painted with messages. "Thank you, Tommies. Many thanks, Yanks. God bless you." From ground level, it was a pageant of gratitude. Children ran with flags stitched from scraps. Women tied white cloths to poles. Men saluted with bare heads. The skies that had once rained fire now glittered with parachutes, sunlight catching the silk as it drifted. One Dutch boy later recalled, "We waved so hard our arms ached. We shouted until our throats hurt. The planes dipped their wings as if waving back. We cried, not because we were sad, but because we were finally not afraid." Meanwhile, in the air, the Allied crews felt something unfamiliar, a kind of redemption. Inside the B-17 Ruthie's Run, Lieutenant Swanson glanced down at the fields below. He could see people running, waving, scattering across the green like tiny sparks of life. He spoke softly into the intercom. "Boys, take a look down there. That's what peace looks like." His crew fell silent. No one cracked a joke. The navigator muttered a single word. "Beautiful." The co-pilot crossed himself without realizing it. In the air, British and American bombers passed each other in opposite directions, waving wings in acknowledgement, as if the sky itself were hosting a quiet procession. Pilots exchanged brief radio greetings. "Good show, Manna." "Same to you, Chowhound. Keep her steady." No one fired a single shot. No flak, no dogfights, no alarms, only engines, wind, and a shared understanding that this, finally, was what all their machines were meant to do. For those few days, war paused, not because peace had been declared, but because humanity had forced a crack in its machinery. On May 6th, a Dutch priest climbed to the bell tower of a church in Gouda, a church whose bells had been stripped for German industry years earlier. He brought with him a metal pot and a hammer. As the bombers passed, he struck it again and again, letting the sound carry. The people below stopped to listen. The ringing, uneven and hollow, echoed through the town. It was not a bell, but it was enough. That same night, as the planes made their last drops, the horizon flickered. Flashes of artillery far to the east. Germany was surrendering. In the Netherlands, the people did not yet cheer. They were too tired for joy. But they looked up at the sky, and for the first time, they felt unafraid. For one fragile week, the air had belonged to mercy. And when the engines finally fell silent, their echoes remained. A hum that seemed to linger in the clouds, as though the sky itself remembered what it felt like to forgive. The day began quietly, too quietly to be believed. The air was still, heavy with the scent of spring soil and smoke, the faint sweetness of bread still baking in ovens that had been cold all winter. Then, as if carried by the wind itself, came a whisper that passed from street to street, farm to farm, mouth to mouth. "The Germans have surrendered." At first, no one dared to move. No one dared to trust it. Rumors had come before, false dawns that ended in darkness. But this time the silence of the guns was real. The checkpoints were abandoned. German trucks stood motionless, their soldiers dazed, unarmed, waiting. The occupation, 5 years of hunger, fear, and humiliation, had ended without a shot. In Amsterdam, the church bells rang for the first time since they had been silenced. Some were not real bells, but makeshift metal drums, beaten with hammers, clanging out of tune, yet achingly alive. The sound rolled across canals and rooftops like thunder that brought no rain. People emerged from their homes, frail, pale, blinking into sunlight that seemed almost too bright. Flags appeared as if by magic, red, white, and blue banners, pulled from attics and hidden cupboards, sewn from bedsheets, patched with hope. Children painted their faces with chalk and soot. Women stood in doorways, weeping openly, not from sadness, but from disbelief. In the distance came another sound, engines, this time belonging not to bombers, but to tanks and jeeps. The Allies were coming. On the roads leading into The Hague and Rotterdam, columns of Canadian and British soldiers advanced slowly through cheering crowds. Flowers rained over their vehicles. Men in uniform, hardened by years of war, wiped tears from their faces as women pressed flowers into their hands and kissed them through the open hatches. For many Dutch, it was the first time they had seen Allied soldiers in the flesh. To them, these were not conquerors or strangers. They were the embodiment of freedom, of breath itself returning to lungs too long clenched. Near the coast, a group of children followed a convoy on bicycles, singing old patriotic songs their parents had forbidden them to sing for years. A woman handed a soldier a loaf of bread, still warm from her oven. He took a bite and whispered, "It's the best I've ever had." The people laughed through tears. They were thin, sick, many barely able to stand, yet joy lifted them like wind through grass. The soldiers, too, seemed humbled. They had seen liberation elsewhere, in France, Belgium, Germany, but here it carried a different texture. There were no parades, no trumpets, no flags of conquest, only quiet awe. In a letter home, one British sergeant wrote, "They do not shout, they do not dance. They touch us, as if to be sure we are real. They hand us bread and cry. I think they have forgotten how to be loud." Meanwhile, high above, the final flights of Operation Chowhound still crossed the sky. The food drops continued until May 8th, even after the surrender, ensuring that no one else would die before help could arrive by land. From his base in England, Lieutenant Robert "Bob" Swanson watched the last mission take off. He was not flying that day. He stood beside the runway, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the horizon. The bombers disappeared into the clouds one by one, their engines fading into a distant hum that sounded to him like an ending. That night, in the dim barracks light, he opened his journal and wrote, "We flew low and dropped food. No flak, no fear, no orders that required hate. For the first time, I felt we were doing something right." He underlined the last word twice. On the other side of the sea, in the Netherlands, people gathered to bury the winter. They tore down German signs, reopened schools, rebuilt ovens, repaired bridges. Children scavenged the silk parachutes from the fields and turned them into dresses, tablecloths, christening gowns. The remnants of salvation became woven into daily life. An old man in Rotterdam, too weak to join the crowds, sat by his window and watched the flags wave. He whispered to his grandson, "Remember this day, boy. Remember how the sky gave us bread." The boy nodded, though he did not yet understand. In the coming weeks, Allied medical teams arrived. Hospitals filled not with the wounded of battle, but with the broken of starvation, bones like reeds, eyes too large for their faces. Doctors worked quietly, feeding patients teaspoon by teaspoon. Recovery was not immediate. Some could not be saved. The famine had carved too deep. But the dying slowed. The ovens stayed lit. The air lost its silence. And through it all, a new kind of memory began to form, one not of victory, but of survival. In every street and field, the same refrain echoed, "The bombers fed us." Not the generals, not the occupiers, not even the soldiers who marched through town, but the men in the sky, unseen except as shadows against the light. When night fell, the Netherlands was still. Candles burned in windows, small flames flickering against the dark. Families prayed, not for the dead this time, but for the living, and for the strange, fragile mercy that had carried them here. The war was over, yet its echo remained in every breath, every crust of bread, every star in the clearing sky. For 5 years they had looked upward in fear. Now, at last, they could look up in peace. Years later, when the fields were green again and the scars of occupation had softened into history, the Dutch still spoke of that week, the week when the bombers fed them, not as soldiers, not as conquerors, but as bearers of mercy. Children who had once chased falling parachutes grew into adults who told their own children about the bread from heaven. They remembered the sound of the engines before they saw the planes, the trembling of the ground beneath their feet, the strange brightness of the sky, and how, for a moment, it felt as though the world itself had paused to breathe again. The famine had ended, but its shadow lingered. In every family, there was someone who had not survived the winter, a mother, a brother, a child. Their absence became part of the silence that followed liberation. Yet even that grief seemed to soften when the memory of those planes returned. For the first time, the machinery of war had been used to preserve, not destroy, and that inversion, that moral turning, became something sacred. In the post-war years, many of the surviving Dutch families kept the empty sacks from Operation Chowhound. The coarse fabric, stamped with USA flour or British Army supplies, was carefully washed, cut, and sewn into whatever was needed. Shirts, dresses, pillowcases, curtains. Some were used as baptism gowns for babies born in peace. Others became flags hung from windows every Liberation Day. The same cloth that once fell from bomb bays now fluttered in celebration of life. One woman, interviewed decades later, held up her wedding dress made from an American flour sack and said softly, "It was the only white fabric I could find. When I wore it, I thought of the sky." The airmen, too, carried their memories quietly. For Lieutenant Bob Swanson, the missions over the Netherlands were the last he would ever fly. The war ended before his 35th sortie. He went home to Wisconsin that summer, back to the farm and the long, flat fields, not unlike the ones he had seen from the cockpit. Sometimes, while threshing wheat, he would stop, look up, and hear in his mind the echo of engines. He kept one small relic, a Dutch postcard mailed to the base months later, the handwriting shaky but clear. "To the men who came in the silver birds, you gave us bread, you gave us back the taste of hope. We will not forget." He never did, and yet the world moved on. The bombers that once saved a nation were soon scrapped for metal or displayed in museums, relics of another age. Children walked past them, unaware that those hollow shells had once carried life instead of death. But in the Netherlands, remembrance took on a quieter form. Every May, the people gathered in fields and town squares to honor both the dead and the saved. Flowers were laid at memorial stones, bells tolled at twilight, and candles flickered in windows. And when the ceremony ended, someone always looked upward, not out of fear, but gratitude. The survivors spoke not of victory, but of humility, for they had learned that survival was not born from conquest, but compassion, and that mercy, too, could fall from the sky. Historians would later describe Operation Chowhound and Operation Manna in terms of logistics. 11,000 tons of food, 5,500 flights, no losses, not a single shot fired. But numbers cannot hold the texture of that moment. The smell of bread baking after months of famine, the sound of children laughing through tears, the image of parachutes caught in the branches like ghosts of grace. One Dutch witness recalled, "They dropped food on us, as if feeding the earth itself. We looked up and saw not machines, but mercy made metal. And perhaps that was the true meaning of it. Not the tonnage, not the strategy, but the transformation itself. That the same wings that once carried death could be turned toward life, that human hands, capable of destruction, could also choose to heal." In that sense, Operation Chowhound was not merely an end, but a revelation. The war had shown mankind its capacity for horror. But in those 7 days above the starving Netherlands, it also revealed something else, a glimpse of what redemption might look like when born from exhaustion, not triumph. It is easy to remember wars for their battles, for the cities burned, the flags raised, the treaties signed. But there are quieter victories that leave no ruins behind. Victories made of bread, of silence, of shared humanity, rediscovered at the edge of despair. For the Dutch, the sound of bombers would never again mean terror. For the Americans and British who flew them, those missions became the only ones they were truly proud to tell their children about. Years later, Swanson, now an old man, stood before one of those preserved aircraft at a museum in Ohio. He ran his fingers along the cold metal and whispered to his grandson, "This plane once dropped food instead of bombs. That was the best thing I ever did." Outside, a summer storm gathered. Thunder rolled across the horizon, distant, echoing, like the hum of remembered engines. He looked up. The clouds were heavy, grey, shifting. For a moment, they seemed to carry the outline of wings. The memory of the sky had never left him. In the Netherlands, on a quiet field near The Hague, a small plaque stands where one of the drops had taken place. It reads, "Here, in May 1945, the bombers brought food instead of fire. We were hungry, and they fed us." Each year, school children visit. They bring flowers, bread, and small paper airplanes. They let them fall gently from their hands, watching them drift to the grass, just as their grandparents once watched real parachutes descend from the heavens. The camera lingers on this scene, the sky wide, open, infinite. No flames, no fear, only the slow breathing of peace.